What's growing on, gardeners? It's Sunday, September 10th, and we're a week and a half away from the official start of fall. And for many of us, this is the best time of year to plant a tree. So on today's video, I'm going to share with you 2 critical mistakes you must avoid when it comes time to plant that tree.
If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and hit the bell to receive new video notifications, and check out our Amazon store and Spreadshop links in the video description for everything I use in my garden and awesome custom designed apparel and other gear. Your support is greatly appreciated.
Here on my channel, I mainly focus on growing food, so most of the trees that I grow are fruit trees. However, this holds true for all trees, whether they are fruit trees or not. The first critical mistake that many growers make is they spend more money up front for a larger tree, thinking if I plant a larger tree from the get-go, I will get a tree that has more vigor and will fruit for me more quickly. Well, this is actually one of those cases where you don't get what you pay for up front, and you should actually purchase a smaller tree. The truth is that in many cases, smaller fruit trees are like coiled springs that are ready to explode the moment you put them in ground, whereas larger fruit trees are often stressed out and root bound in a container. So the larger the tree that you plant, the more likely that tree is to suffer transplant shock, and the more likely it is to just languish in ground not knowing what to do, whereas the smaller trees are actually less stressed out when you transplant them and more likely to just explode with growth. And I want to show you exactly what I'm talking about with a real-world example. These 2 fruit trees that you see right in front of you are apple trees that I purchased from Cummins Nursery last spring. So believe it or not, these trees have only been in ground for 16 months, and they were both purchased as bare root trees. Now this tree right here that you see is a wine crisp tree. It was a grade 1 tree, meaning it was the most prime tree that they carry in terms of size, aside from grade 0. So this is just about as large of a tree that you could get from them bare root. Whereas right here, this sundowner tree was a grade 3 tree. It was 20 or 30% less expensive and substantially smaller. Yet despite the fact that I planted both at the same time and this tree started out way larger, this tree has dramatically taken over and it is much more vigorous. In fact, I'm going to overlay a picture of what they both looked like the day that I planted them, and you can see how much larger the grade 1 wine crisp was over the grade 3 sundowner. Yet this tree, I have had to cut it back time after time because it was just a coiled spring that exploded, and a lot of that, I think, is due to the fact that this tree started off as a smaller bare root tree. So when I transplanted it, it was just ready to go. I will bring you in for a closer look. So this right here is the smaller grade 3 sundowner apple tree, and I have been espaliering it on 3 individual steel cables, and as you can see, this tree has completely filled out all 3 of the cables on all 3 of the cordons. Overall, it is looking great, and it still has 3 apples on it its first full season in ground. And as crazy as it is, because of how vigorous this tree has been, I keep cutting it back and it keeps producing more and more flowers, but they are all going to drop because they didn't cross-pollinate, and also it wouldn't form in a fruit anyway because the season is most of the way over. And this actually used to have 4 apples on it, but I accidentally knocked one off when I was putting these organza bags on them to prevent the pests. Now side by side, when you look at the originally much larger wine crisp tree, it hasn't filled out all 3 of the cordons. It's filled out the lower cordon completely, the second cordon looks really good, and the top cordon still has a ways to go, and it has 1 apple on it. It had 2, but I accidentally knocked one off when I was placing the organza bags over them. I will say that the apple on this tree is larger, but I think it is actually an earlier variety, and since it only has 1 fruit on it, it is obviously ahead of the game there. But it goes to show you that the phrase, "you get what you pay for," is not always the case. When it comes to planting trees, a lot of times you should spend less money and get a smaller tree, because the smaller trees will react to transplanting better, they will go through less shock and stress, and they will actually overtake the larger tree. So this is a great example of that right there. Now, I will say that while it is generally better to plant a smaller tree than a larger tree when it comes to transplant shock, there is a bit of a law of diminishing returns here. For example, this right here is a bay tree, also known as a bay laurel. This is where you get the bay leaf for cooking soups and stews and things like that. Now, I purchased this online, and it came in this little tiny square pot. The whole tree probably was only this big. And if I knew that if I were to transplant a tree that small, there's a great chance that it could be eaten by a rabbit or destroyed by some other animal, or that it just wouldn't take. It could be suffocated by mulch, it could be overtaken by weeds, etc. So you don't want to plant a tree when they're really, really tiny. So that's why I transplanted it into this flower pot here. I want this to grow in my sunroom and overwinter it all throughout the winter, so it gets to be more like this tall, and then I will transplant it in ground when it's a much larger tree come spring and let it establish all throughout the growing season before it has to face its first frosts and freezes the following year. So sometimes when you see those really small trees that come in those really tiny banded pots, they may actually be too small for you to plant. However, when you're buying things like bare root trees, those grade 3 trees are really nice. When it comes to buying a container tree, I think the trees that are in the 3-gallon pots are usually the most ready to go, and you don't necessarily need to spend more money on something like a 7 or 10 or 15-gallon pot or larger, unless you're doing something like planting a full-size palm tree in ground because you want that immediate ornamental effect or something along those lines. A lot of times you're better off spending less money and getting the trees that are not root bound, because they are more likely to undergo less transplant shock, and like I said, they just explode like a coiled spring when they're transplanted. And the second critical mistake that growers make when planting a tree is they don't remove enough of the lawn area around the tree that they're planting, or they allow weeds to encroach upon the area after the tree is transplanted. I can't tell you how many times I walk around my neighborhood and I see the trunks of trees overwhelmed by weeds or a grass lawn that has grown back into the area, and you can clearly see how much the trees are struggling. And that's because if you allow any weeds or any grass to grow around the area that the trees are growing in, they're actually competing with those surface roots of the trees. And the younger the tree is, the less well established the tree is, so the more nutrients that tree needs to grow nice, big, and healthy roots. So those trees are actually being outcompeted by the roots of the lawn or the weeds that are growing around those trees, and you can see them struggling clearly. Now, if you want to plant a tree in the middle of your lawn and you need to remove some of the sod in order to plant the tree, I recommend that you remove at least one circle that is 3 feet in total diameter. But of course, the more lawn you can remove, the better. The more empty area that the fruit tree roots do not have to compete with any other grasses, the better. Now, in my backyard, it's a little bit different because I'm growing things in a bit of an edible landscaping scenario, and I like to keep a much wider area that is completely free of grass and weeds. Let me show you what I'm talking about. For backyard tree plantings, I like to plant my fruit trees in higher density. I only space my trees about 6 to 7 feet apart on average. So, because they're spaced so closely, eventually over time, the roots will actually begin to compete, which is actually something I did on purpose because I want to somewhat dwarf the trees so they don't get too unruly in my backyard setting. That being said, when you actually transplant the trees, it is very important that you keep them in a completely weed-free environment that is well mulched. And from the back of my fence to the front of the brick border is 48 inches or 4 feet. I want to keep them as weed-free as possible because any grass that encroaches on those trees is going to rob them of nutrients. And I'm also putting down things like fertilizer and compost around all of the trees. I don't want to be fertilizing weeds. I want 100% of that fertilizer and compost to go to the trees and benefit them as much as possible. So I work really hard to keep my areas around the trees as free of weeds as possible. Now, luckily, when you keep a 4-inch thick mulch layer around all your trees, that does the bulk of the work for you in terms of weeding, because any weed seeds that are in the air that lay on top of the mulch usually fail to reach the soil level, and then they cannot germinate, or they will germinate so shallow in the mulch that you can just easily pull them here and there in a matter of seconds. So it's very important that you keep as weed-free of an area as possible for these trees. Many of you have asked how I keep my fig trees so healthy and vigorous. These are some of the first trees that I planted in ground along the border of my property. Well, the secret to that is lots of organic matter in the form of mulch and compost, and of course you keep the area as weed-free as possible so they have nothing to compete with except for themselves. And when you do that, you basically keep their vigor at maximum. That way 100% of the nutrients go only to that tree, and when you do that you can get spectacular results, like this grapevine here that's only a year and a half old, that has been loaded up with grapes all season. Every time I want a handful of grapes, I just come out and I pick them. And let me tell you, I don't know if there's anything better in terms of grapes than this amazing Mrs. Munson variety. Yeah, they are seeded, but boy oh boy, do they give you a delicious, delicious taste. So what do you do if you have some trees planted that you may have neglected a bit and some of the grass has overtaken the area? Well, this right here is a Canary Island date palm that I'm growing in Zone 8A that has been a surprisingly good performer for me, and I fertilized and composted and mulched around it in the beginning of the spring, but since then the mulch has broken down. So as you can see, the centipede grass around the bottom of the tree is starting to grow in. Again, I'm going to simply remove all of that with an edger. I'm going to pull it back, and I'm going to place at least a 3-foot diameter of new compost and mulch around the tree. If I can get closer to 4 feet in diameter of the circle, that's even better. The goal will be to clear out the area around my Canary Island date palm to look more like the area around the sable palmetto that I have growing in the front of my house. You can see this area right here. It's a nice 4-foot diameter circle around the base of the tree, and that basically stops most of the centipede grass runners from encroaching on the surface. Every now and again I just edge around this area and remove the runners, and then 1 to 2 times a year I just place new mulch around the base of this tree, and that will keep it happy and it'll keep the weed pressure to near zero. And that right there are 2 critical mistakes that you should avoid when planting new trees. All you really have to do is, when selecting your trees, if you're buying a tree that is in containers, buy the smaller trees that are in containers that you are sure are not root bound. And if you're purchasing bare root trees, make sure you get these smaller grade trees that are still a reasonable size but not too large, so they will suffer from less transplant shock when it comes time to plant them in the ground. And of course, when you finally do transplant them into the ground, keep the general area around that tree as free of weeds and lawn and other grasses as possible, because we want 100% of the nutrients in the soil to go to the trees, not to the weeds and other grasses around them, and we don't want other roots out competing the new fragile roots of your new trees. So everybody, I sure hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and please ring that notification bell so you're notified when we release more videos like these. If you're curious about any of the products that I use for real life in my vegetable garden or that I use to take care of my fruit trees, they are all linked down below on my Amazon storefront in the video description. So expand the video description, click on the Amazon link, you'll see everything I use in real life. And while you're there, check out my spread shop for custom merch if you want to support the channel. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see all of you again on the next video.
We have a really good boy waiting patiently for his breakfast this morning. And boy, did I make him something good with homemade food. We have eye-round beef with broccoli and sweet potatoes and carrots and a little bit of jasmine rice. And he's got his vitamins on it. And then we're going to top it with just a little bit of dry food like croutons on top of a salad. Now we're going to bring it over to feed him. And he's still patiently waiting. Dale, come. Oh, there he goes. He's a very good listener, a very sweet boy. We're very proud of this guy.